The cabin door hung by a single hinge, swinging wildly in the howling wind as Aaron Mitchell pressed his back against the crumbling stone fireplace. Vincent Hartley's shotgun barrel gleaming in the flickering light of the collapsing structure. Smoke choked the air, flames licking up from the oil-soaked floorboards Vincent's men had doused minutes earlier. Nova, 70 pounds of German Shepherd fury, stood between Aaron and certain death, jaws locked around a leather document bag, blood from a gash on her shoulder mixing with the ash settling on her dark coat. The basement beneath them groaned as water from the swollen mountain creek poured through cracks in the foundation, rising fast, cutting off their escape route through the tunnel they'd discovered only an hour before. Vincent's face twisted with rage as he advanced, his polished shoes crunching on broken glass, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Aaron's mind raced through impossible choices, his hands gripping the iron poker from the fireplace, knowing that in seconds one of them would be dead, and 40 years of buried secrets would either surface or drown forever in the flooding darkness below. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. 3 months earlier, Aaron Mitchell stood in the parking lot of Mountain View Bank in eastern West Virginia, staring at the rejection letter that had just shattered his plans to start a small construction business. The loan officer, a crisp woman in her 50s, had smiled apologetically as she explained that despite his 12 years of military service as a combat engineer, despite his honorable discharge and clean record, his credit history was too thin, too uncertain. Aaron had watched through the glass door as she returned to her desk and immediately approved a loan for a young white couple who'd walked in after him, their laughter carrying across the lobby like salt in a wound. He crumpled the letter slowly, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion that came from fighting battles nobody wanted to acknowledge existed. His Uncle Henry had warned him about Vincent Hartley, the bank's president, a man whose family had controlled lending in these Appalachian hollows for 3 generations, a man whose name appeared on deeds and foreclosure notices throughout the county like a signature of slow theft. 2 weeks after that rejection, Uncle Henry died suddenly, the doctor citing heart failure, though Henry had passed his physical just months before with flying colors. At the funeral, sparse and quiet, Aaron received an envelope from Henry's attorney containing a deed to a remote cabin, a check for $600, and a handwritten note that simply read, "When you get to the cabin, trust Nova more than anyone." The name meant nothing to Aaron then, but 4 days later, a German Shepherd appeared at his apartment door, a tag on her collar engraved with that single word and Henry's phone number. Nova was not an ordinary dog, and Aaron recognized that within the first hour of her arrival, she moved with military precision, responded to hand signals Aaron hadn't taught her, and refused to eat the canned food he'd picked up from the local grocery store, nosing the bowl away with clear suspicion. That first night, Nova positioned herself by the door, ears rotating like radar dishes, a low growl building in her chest whenever footsteps passed in the hallway outside. Aaron sat on the floor beside her, running his fingers through her thick coat, noticing scars hidden beneath the fur, the kind of marks working dogs carried from years of service. He found a photo tucked into her collar that night, its edges worn soft with handling. The image showed Uncle Henry, decades younger in military fatigues, kneeling beside a German Shepherd that could have been Nova's twin, both of them alert and proud against a backdrop of sandbags and desert sand. On the back, in Henry's careful handwriting, K9 Unit, Operation Desert Storm, Shadow and Me. Aaron's throat tightened as he studied Nova's intelligent amber eyes, understanding dawning slowly. He pulled out his phone and searched through Henry's belongings that the attorney had forwarded, finding a leather journal buried beneath folded clothes. The entries were sparse, dated over the past year, but one passage stopped his breath cold. Vincent Hartley has stolen land from 12 families in this county since 1975. All of them black veterans who came home to find their service meant nothing against his lawyers and forged documents. I'm number 13. He tried to take my grandfather's land in 85. Succeeded with the Briggs family in 83. The Washingtons in 92. The pattern is clear. The proof is in the old cabin, the one everyone thinks is cursed. That's where he's hidden the evidence all these years, and that's why 3 people have died trying to expose him. Aaron spent the next week preparing, researching property records at the county courthouse, discovering that the cabin Henry left him sat on land that had changed hands suspiciously often, always ending up in Hartley family control before being sold for pennies to outsiders who never stayed long. Nova accompanied him everywhere, her presence drawing curious stares and occasional hostile glances in the small mountain town where Confederate flags still flew from pickup trucks and certain establishments went quiet when Aaron entered. At the hardware store, buying supplies for the cabin expedition, the clerk shortchanged him by $20, then argued when Aaron pointed it out, his voice rising loud enough to draw a crowd. Nova's hackles rose, a warning rumble building, and the clerk backed down quickly, throwing the correct change across the counter. Outside, an elderly black man approached Aaron carefully, introducing himself as Harold Briggs. His voice was soft, but urgent, as he warned Aaron about the cabin, about Vincent Hartley's reach, about the way justice worked differently in these mountains, depending on the color of your skin. But Harold's eyes lingered on Nova with recognition and something like hope, and he pressed a folded map into Aaron's hand before walking away. That night, Aaron spread the map across his kitchen table, Nova's head resting on his knee as he traced the route to the cabin. The location was marked with an X, surrounded by notations in Henry's handwriting about entry points, trap locations, and a single underlined phrase, "Basement behind the fireplace holds everything." Aaron looked down at Nova, whose steady gaze seemed to hold decades of patient determination. He made his decision then, speaking aloud to the dog who'd become his unexpected partner in seeking truth. "Tomorrow, we go to the cabin and finish what Henry started," he said quietly. Nova's tail thumped once against the floor, a soldier acknowledging orders, and Aaron felt the first stirring of hope that justice might still be possible, even here, even now. Aaron's military background had taught him to plan meticulously, to anticipate variables, to never enter hostile territory without understanding the terrain and the enemy. He'd spent 8 years as a combat engineer, diffusing explosives in places where one wrong move meant death, where the difference between coming home and being shipped home in a box was measured in millimeters and milliseconds. But the war he'd returned to on American soil was different, more insidious, fought not with IEDs and ambushes but with paperwork, denied opportunities, and the casual cruelty of a system that viewed his service as insufficient proof of his worth. The PTSD came not from the explosions he'd survived overseas but from the slow realization that the country he'd bled for saw him first as black and only distantly as a veteran. Uncle Henry had been his anchor through those dark months after discharge, the only family member who hadn't suggested Aaron was exaggerating the discrimination, who understood that racism wasn't always burning crosses and slurs, but could be a lone officer's sympathetic smile as she denied him capital, a landlord's sudden unavailability when he showed up to view an apartment, the way job interviewers' expressions shifted when he walked through the door. Henry had raised Aaron after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, had encouraged him to join the military as a path to stability and respect, and had spent the last 20 years of his life trying to recover land stolen from their family by men like Vincent Hartley. Now Henry was gone, and Aaron was left holding the pieces of an unfinished crusade, with only a German shepherd and a dead man's journal as guides. He'd found more in Henry's belongings over the past week, medical records that told a story the death certificate had glossed over. The hospital had noted elevated arsenic levels in Henry's blood during his final admission, but the attending physician, a golf partner of Vincent Hartley's according to local gossip, had attributed it to environmental exposure and listed the cause of death as natural cardiac arrest. Aaron had held those records with shaking hands, rage and grief warring in his chest, as Nova pressed against his leg with the steady pressure of someone who understood loss. The bond between Aaron and Nova deepened in those early days with the intensity of soldiers in a foxhole, built on mutual dependence and shared purpose. She was not a pet but a partner, and Aaron quickly learned to read her signals as clearly as he'd once read topographical maps. When Nova's ears flattened and her body went rigid, danger was imminent. When she circled back to check on him during their practice hikes through the foothills, she was establishing patrol patterns. When she refused the food he'd purchased from certain stores, Aaron learned to trust her instincts and discovered, through careful research, that arsenic could be tasteless and odorless but dogs could detect it through scent. He began preparing their meals himself, buying ingredients from different sources, varying their routines. Nova slept across the threshold of his bedroom door each night, positioning herself where she could monitor both the entrance and Aaron simultaneously. During 1:03 a.m., security check, Nova had detected an intruder attempting to pick the lock on Aaron's apartment. her warning growl waking Aaron seconds before the door handle turned. He'd called the police, but by the time they arrived 30 minutes later, the would-be burglar had vanished, leaving only scratches on the lock mechanism. The responding officers took a cursory report, their skepticism evident when Aaron suggested it might be connected to his investigation into Henry's death. One officer, older and weathered, had paused at the door and said quietly, "Look, son, I'd let this thing with Henry rest. Vincent Hartley's got friends in every office in this county. You keep poking around, you might not like what pokes back." Nova had positioned herself between Aaron and the officers then, not aggressive but immovable, and Aaron had felt a surge of gratitude for this four-legged guardian who asked nothing except his trust. He'd spent hours that night going through the photos tucked into Henry's journal, finding images of Nova's father, Shadow, a decorated K-9 who'd served 3 tours and saved 17 soldiers' lives before dying of cancer at age 12. Henry had written about Shadow with reverence, describing the dog's intelligence, loyalty, and uncanny ability to sense danger before humans could perceive it. Nova, it seemed, had inherited more than just her father's appearance. The trip to the local cemetery came on Nova's initiative, not Aaron's planning. They'd been walking the perimeter of town, Aaron mentally mapping routes to the cabin and noting which roads had security cameras, when Nova suddenly pulled hard on the leash, dragging him toward the wrought iron gates of Mountain View Memorial Gardens. Aaron followed, curious, as Nova navigated the rows of headstones with clear purpose, finally stopping at a weathered granite marker near the back fence, where maintenance was sporadic and weeds grew thick. The inscription read, "James Henry Mitchell, born 1920, died 1985, beloved father and veteran, stolen land never forgotten." Aaron knelt slowly, fingers tracing the unexpected final line, as Nova began digging at the base of the stone with focused intensity. "Hey, stop that," Aaron said reflexively. But Nova ignored him, her paws working steadily until she'd exposed a metal box buried 6 inches down, its surface corroded by decades of moisture. Aaron's hands trembled as he pried it open, finding documents inside sealed in plastic, land deeds dating back to 1945 showing continuous Mitchell family ownership of 200 acres in the Western Hills, and a court filing from 1985 disputing foreclosure proceedings initiated by Hartley Bank. There were letters, too, from James Mitchell to various attorneys and government offices, describing how Vincent Hartley's father had used predatory lending practices to seize property from black veterans returning from World War II in Korea, how the Mitchells had been fighting this theft for 40 years across 2 generations. The final letter, unsent and addressed to the Department of Justice, was dated 1 week before James Mitchell died suddenly of a stroke at age 65. Aaron sat back on his heels, the pieces connecting with devastating clarity. This wasn't just about Henry. This was a family legacy of resistance against systematic theft, and Vincent Hartley had been eliminating anyone who got close to exposing the truth. He looked at Nova, who sat calmly beside the disturbed grave, and understood that she'd been trained for this moment, prepared by Henry to lead Aaron to evidence scattered across the county like breadcrumbs. "You knew," Aaron whispered to the dog. "Henry taught you where everything was hidden." Nova's tail wagged once, a confirmation, and Aaron felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a deployment order. That evening, he built a fire in the small charcoal grill outside his apartment, and he and Nova sat together in the gathering darkness, Aaron's hand resting on her neck as he spoke aloud the promise he was making to his grandfather, his uncle, and all the families who'd been robbed. "We're going to finish this. We're going to bring Vincent Hartley down and get justice for everyone he's hurt, even if it costs everything." Nova leaned against him, solid and warm, and for the first time since leaving the military, Aaron felt like he had a mission worth the risk. Deputy Emma Ross found them 2 days later, pulling up to Aaron's apartment in an unmarked sedan just as he was loading camping gear into his truck. Emma was in her early 30s, compact and direct, with the kind of observant eyes that missed nothing. She introduced herself carefully, acknowledging that she knew about Henry's death and Aaron's questions about it, and Aaron's first instinct was distrust, another official coming to shut him down or worse. But Emma pulled out a folder from her vehicle and laid it on the truck's hood, showing him police reports from 3 deaths at the cabin over the past 4 decades, All ruled accidental with minimal investigation. I was 10 when my dad died, Emma said quietly, her drawl thickening with emotion. He was a veteran too, Army Ranger, came back from the Gulf, and couldn't get work anywhere in this county except as a night janitor. He used to talk about how the system was rigged, how men like Vincent Hartley kept people like us in our place. Not all of us, obviously, she added, gesturing to her own white skin. But he saw it happening to his buddies who weren't white, and it ate at him. She tapped the reports with one finger. These deaths weren't investigated properly because the sheriff at the time was Vincent's cousin. I became a cop to change things, but there's only so much I can do alone. If you're planning to go to that cabin, you need to know what you're walking into. Aaron studied her carefully, weighing trust against paranoia, and Nova made the decision for him by approaching Emma and sitting calmly at her feet, accepting the deputy's tentative head scratch without reservation. Okay, Aaron said finally. Tell me everything. Harold Briggs arrived an hour later at Emma's request, the elderly man moving slowly but with dignity, leaning on a carved walking stick. At 75, Harold carried himself like the Marine he'd been in Vietnam, his posture still military straight despite arthritis and age. He sat at Aaron's small kitchen table, accepting coffee with hands that shook slightly, and began to speak about history the county wanted forgotten. Harold's family had owned 50 acres in the prime bottomland near the river, purchased with savings from his grandfather's service in World War I, expanded by his father after World War II. In 1983, Harold's father had taken a loan from Hartley Bank to buy equipment for his logging operation, signing documents he couldn't read well due to limited education. Within 2 years, the loan terms had mysteriously changed, interest rates had ballooned, and foreclosure proceedings began. Harold's father fought it, hired a lawyer from Charleston, started gathering evidence that the contract had been altered after signing. 3 weeks before the court date, he'd driven to the old cabin to retrieve documents he'd hidden there for safekeeping, and he'd never come home. They found his body at the base of a cliff a quarter-mile from the cabin, ruled an accidental fall despite the fact that Robert Briggs had hunted those woods for 30 years and knew every trail by heart. Vincent killed my father, Harold said flatly, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. I've known it for 42 years, but I could never prove it. That cabin holds the proof, Aaron. Vincent's been using it as his personal vault, hiding evidence of every family he's destroyed, every fraudulent document, every forged signature. He made it look cursed, spread rumors about ghosts and bad luck, even rigged up scare tactics to keep people away. But the truth is buried in that basement, behind the old stone fireplace, and anyone who's gotten close to finding it has ended up dead. Harold pulled out a hand-drawn map from his jacket, spreading it across the table, showing details Emma's official records lacked. There's a tunnel system under that cabin, natural caves that connect to the mountain. Vincent knows them. He uses them. If you go in the front door, you need to know there's other ways out and other ways for him to come at you. Emma added her own intel, describing Vincent's security setup, the motion sensors hidden in the trees, the game cameras monitoring approaches. He'll know you're coming within 5 minutes of you setting foot on that property. You'll need a strategy. Aaron looked at the three of them, this unlikely coalition brought together by grief, injustice, and determination, and he felt something shift in his chest, the isolation of the past months giving way to the understanding that he wasn't alone in this fight. Then we make a plan, he said, and we do this right. The planning took 3 days of careful preparation, mapping routes, timing approaches, gathering equipment. Aaron spent his savings on climbing gear, waterproof document bags, a high-quality camera for evidence collection, and cold-weather clothing. Emma ran background checks on Vincent's known associates, identifying 2 men who served as his enforcers, both with assault records that had been mysteriously dismissed. Harold provided detailed knowledge of the terrain, drawing on decades of hunting experience to show Aaron how to approach the cabin from downwind, how to avoid the most obvious paths, where to cache supplies for a quick escape. They couldn't get a search warrant because the judge was Vincent's former law school roommate, and attempting to involve federal authorities would tip their hand before they had concrete evidence. This had to be done quietly, decisively, with ironclad documentation that couldn't be dismissed or buried. Aaron requested 1 night alone at the cabin to do initial reconnaissance, promising Emma he'd call for backup if he found anything substantial. She agreed reluctantly. making him promise to wear a GPS tracker and check in every 2 hours. The night before the mission, Aaron sat on his apartment floor with Nova, going through their gear methodically, attaching a small LED light to her collar along with a compact camera that could record her perspective. He'd trained with military working dogs overseas and knew their capabilities, but Nova exceeded every benchmark, learning hand signals within minutes, demonstrating problem-solving skills that bordered on uncanny. "Tomorrow we go into enemy territory," Aaron told her, and Nova's ears pricked forward, her entire body focusing on him with the intensity of a soldier receiving orders. "We find the evidence, we document everything, and we get out alive. Can you do that with me?" Nova's answer was to place her paw in his hand, a gesture Henry must have taught her, and Aaron felt his throat tighten with emotion and determination. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it together. 2 soldiers against an enemy who'd operated with impunity for too long, carrying the weight of generations who'd been silenced and stolen from, fighting not just for justice but for the radical idea that black lives and black dignity mattered, as much as white comfort and white profit. The approach to the cabin began at dusk on a Friday evening in late October, when the temperature in the Appalachian highlands dropped to near freezing and fog rolled through the valleys like smoke. Aaron parked his truck 3 miles from the target location, at an abandoned logging station Harold had recommended, and began the hike in with Nova ranging ahead, her dark coat blending into the gathering shadows. The forest was dense with oak and hickory, their bare branches creating a skeletal canopy overhead, and the ground was carpeted with leaves that crunched underfoot despite Aaron's careful steps. He moved with the methodical pace he'd learned in combat zones, pausing every 50 yards to listen, watching Nova's body language for signs of danger. The dog operated like a trained scout, checking potential ambush points, circling back to ensure Aaron followed the safest route, her nose working constantly to sample the air for human scent. They crossed 2 ridgelines before the cabin came into view through the trees, a sagging structure of weathered logs and a rusted metal roof, windows dark and empty like eye sockets in a skull. Even from 200 yards away, Aaron could feel the weight of the place, the accumulated dread of decades, and the deliberate menace Vincent had cultivated to keep people away. Nova stopped at the tree line, hackles rising slightly, a low whine escaping her throat. Aaron knelt beside her, scanning the cabin through binoculars, noting the game cameras mounted on trees at regular intervals, their lenses pointed at every approach. Harold had been right about the surveillance, which meant Vincent would know they were here soon. The question was how quickly he'd respond and with how much force. Aaron checked his watch, noting the time for his first check-in with Emma, then signaled Nova forward with a hand gesture that meant proceed with caution. The cabin's front porch sagged dangerously, boards rotted through in places, and Aaron tested each step before committing his weight, aware that a broken ankle here would be catastrophic. Nova leaped the gaps easily, waiting at the door while Aaron worked on the padlock with bolt cutters. The lock snapped with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet forest, and Aaron froze, listening for reaction. Nothing stirred except wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. He pushed the door open slowly, its hinges shrieking protest, and stepped into darkness thick enough to taste. His flashlight beam cut through blackness, illuminating a single room that had once been someone's home but was now stripped to bare essentials: a listing table, a broken chair, an ancient iron stove in the corner. The air smelled of rot and animals and something chemical that Aaron couldn't identify. Nova entered cautiously, nose down, working in a methodical grid pattern that Aaron recognized from watching military working dogs search for explosives. She paused at the far wall, where the stone fireplace rose from floor to ceiling, its mortar crumbling with age, and began pawing at the base with focused intensity. Aaron joined her, running his hands over the stones, feeling for irregularities, and found what he was looking for on the right side: 3 stones that shifted when pressed in sequence. The mechanism was crude but effective, and when the 3rd stone clicked inward, a section of the fireplace swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow doorway and wooden stairs descending into absolute darkness. Aaron's pulse quickened as he aimed his flashlight down, the beam showing steps that disappeared into shadow 20 feet below. "This is it," he whispered to Nova, who stood rigid beside him, staring into the opening with ears forward and every muscle tense. He pulled out his phone to text Emma their location and status, but there was no signal this deep in the mountains, just as they'd anticipated. He was on his own now, committed to seeing this through. He attached a climbing rope to a support beam, tested its strength, then started down the stairs with Nova following close behind, both of them descending into the buried secrets of 40 years. The basement was larger than Aaron had expected, a natural cave that had been partially reinforced with timber supports, stretching back into the mountain perhaps 30 feet. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the uneven floor, and the temperature was noticeably colder than above, cold enough that Aaron's breath misted in his flashlight beam. Nova moved ahead carefully, testing the ground, and suddenly froze, her body going completely still in the way that meant immediate danger. Aaron stopped instantly, following her gaze to where his light revealed a tripwire stretched across the path at ankle height. Nearly invisible monofilament fishing line connected to something in the shadows. He knelt slowly, tracing the wire to a cluster of old hand grenades wired together in a crude but lethal configuration. His combat engineer training kicked in automatically, assessing the setup, recognizing it as functional despite its age. Vincent or someone working for him had booby-trapped this basement decades ago, and the ordnance was still live. Aaron spent 15 careful minutes disarming the device, his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, while Nova waited motionless and patient. When the grenades were safely neutralized, Aaron took a moment to breathe, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "Good girl," he murmured to Nova, whose vigilance had just saved both their lives. They moved deeper into the cave, and Aaron's light found what they'd come for, a massive old safe built into a niche in the stone wall, its door marked with the logo of a bank that had gone out of business in the 1970 seconds. The safe was too heavy to move, too thick to break open quickly. But the lock was old-fashioned, the kind Aaron had learned to pick during specialized training. He set down his pack and pulled out the lock-picking tools he'd purchased, settling in for the delicate work of manipulation, while Nova positioned herself facing the stairs, standing guard. 20 minutes later, the safe's door swung open with a groan of protesting metal, and Aaron's flashlight revealed the treasure trove of evidence Harold and Henry had died trying to expose. Inside were accordion files stuffed with documents, organized by year and family name, a meticulous record of systematic theft spanning 4 decades. Aaron pulled out files at random, photographing pages with shaking hands, seeing the pattern repeat with mechanical cruelty across dozens of families. Falsified loan applications with forged signatures, backdated contracts with altered terms, quitclaim deeds signed under duress or outright fabricated, appraisals that undervalued properties by factors of 10, foreclosure notices filed before loans were technically in default. Every document bore the mark of Hartley Bank or Vincent Hartley's personal signature, a paper trail of corruption so extensive and blatant that Aaron couldn't understand how it had remained hidden, but he knew the answer, even as the question formed. This had remained hidden because Vincent controlled the local legal system, the judges, the sheriff, the county clerk. Anyone who'd tried to expose him had been silenced through intimidation, bribery, or in the cases of the most persistent, death. Aaron found a separate file labeled insurance and opened it to discover something even more damning. Medical records and autopsy reports for 5 people including Uncle Henry and Harold's father, along with handwritten notes detailing how arsenic poisoning could mimic heart disease if administered, in small doses over time. Vincent had documented his own crimes with the arrogance of someone who believed he was untouchable. Aaron was photographing the final folder when Nova's warning growl rumbled through the basement, low and urgent. He looked up to see her staring at the stairs, hackles raised, and then he heard it too, footsteps overhead, multiple people moving through the cabin above them. Vincent had come, and he'd brought help. Aaron's military training demanded instant assessment and decision-making. They were trapped in a basement with one exit, against multiple hostiles who knew the terrain. The element of surprise was gone, but Aaron had what he'd come for, evidence that would destroy Vincent Hartley if it reached the authorities. He grabbed the most damning files from the safe, stuffing them into his waterproof document bag, working as quickly as silence allowed. Nova remained at the base of the stairs, her body language shifting from alert to aggressive, and Aaron knew they were running out of time. Above them, a voice called out. Vincent Hartley's cultured drawl, made sinister by its casual tone. "Mr. Mitchell, I know you're down there. My camera showed you entering 23 minutes ago. I'm disappointed, frankly. I thought I'd made it clear that continuing your uncle's investigation would be unwise. Aaron didn't respond, zipping the document bag and slinging it across his chest, securing it tightly. He moved to Nova's side and examined their options. The stairs were the obvious exit but almost certainly covered. He swept his flashlight around the cave more carefully, looking for alternatives, and Nova made the decision for him, moving toward the back of the basement where the cave narrowed into a fissure in the rock. Aaron followed, squeezing through an opening barely wide enough for his shoulders, and found himself in a natural tunnel that angled downward into darkness. Water ran along the floor here, cold enough to numb his feet through his boots, and the sound of it echoed off close walls. Behind them, footsteps descended the stairs, and Vincent's voice continued its one-sided conversation. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Aaron. Your uncle was stubborn too. Look where that got him." Rage and fear warred in Aaron's chest, but he forced both down, focusing on survival and escape. Nova led the way through the tunnel with confidence that suggested she'd been trained for exactly this scenario, and Aaron realized that Henry must have explored these caves, must have known about this escape route, and prepared his dog to navigate it. They moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, hunched over to avoid low-hanging rock, splashing through water that grew deeper with each step. The tunnel branched twice, and both times Nova chose without hesitation, leading them deeper into the mountain. Behind them, flashlight beams bounced off walls and angry voices shouted. But the pursuers were slower, less sure of their path. Aaron and Nova were gaining distance, but to what end he didn't yet know. The tunnel opened abruptly into a larger chamber, and Aaron's flashlight revealed a space perhaps 20 feet across, with a natural rock shelf rising above the water that now flowed past at knee depth. The sound was different here, louder, and Aaron realized with sinking certainty that they'd intersected with an underground stream swollen by recent rains. The water was rising, not quickly but steadily, and the chamber had only 2 exits: the tunnel they'd entered through and another passage on the far side, currently half submerged and filling. Nova barked once, sharp and commanding, then plunged into the water and swam toward the submerged passage. Aaron understood in that instant what she was telling him. This was their only way forward, and they had to take it now before it filled completely. He waded in after her, the cold stealing his breath, water reaching his chest and then his neck as he approached the passage entrance. He could see perhaps 10 feet into it before the tunnel curved, and his light couldn't penetrate further. There was no guarantee it led to the surface, no way to know if it narrowed to impassability or opened into an escape route. But behind them, Vincent and his men were closing in, and staying meant capture or death. Aaron took several deep breaths, hyperventilating to load his blood with oxygen the way he'd been taught in water survival training, then nodded to Nova. The dog dove under, disappearing into the submerged tunnel, and Aaron followed, the icy water closing over his head like a fist, the document bag pulling at his chest, his flashlight beam showing nothing but rock walls pressing in from all sides. He kicked hard, following the faint turbulence of Nova's passage ahead, his lungs already beginning to burn, his mind counting seconds and calculating how long he could hold his breath under stress. 30 seconds passed, then 45, and the tunnel showed no sign of opening. Aaron's chest began to convulse with the need to breathe, his vision narrowing, panic clawing at the edges of his control. At 60 seconds, his hand found Nova's tail ahead of him, and she'd stopped moving. The tunnel had ended in a dead end, or she'd found something he couldn't see. His lungs were screaming now, muscles beginning to spasm. This was it, the moment where he'd either trust his partner completely or die alone in the dark. He pushed forward, felt Nova's body surge upward, and followed, breaking the surface into air and light with a gasp that was half sob. They'd made it through, emerging into another cave chamber lit by gaps in the rock ceiling where moonlight streamed through, a chamber with a slope leading upward toward what looked like freedom. Aaron dragged himself onto the bank, coughing water, shaking with cold and exhaustion and relief, while Nova stood over him, licking his face, making sure he lived. "Good girl," Aaron managed through chattering teeth. "Best damn dog in the world." But even as he spoke, he heard voices echoing from the tunnel behind them, distorted by water and distance but unmistakably close. Vincent Hartley was not giving up, and neither could they. Aaron and Nova climbed the rocky slope toward the cave opening, muscles burning, clothes soaked and freezing, but the promise of escape drove them forward. They emerged into the forest just as full darkness settled over the mountains. the temperature plummeting toward the teens, and Aaron knew hypothermia would kill them as surely as Vincent's bullets if they didn't find warmth soon. But before he could orient himself, Nova's body went rigid, her gaze fixed on a point 30 yards downslope where the trees thinned. Aaron followed her line of sight and felt his stomach drop. Vincent Hartley stood there in an expensive wool coat and leather gloves, utterly composed despite the remote location, a shotgun cradled in his arms like a country gentleman on a hunt. 2 men flanked him, both large and armed, their faces shadowed but their posture radiating menace. Vincent had anticipated their exit point, had positioned himself perfectly, and Aaron realized with cold clarity that the older man knew these caves intimately because he'd used them before, to dispose of bodies or escape after committing his crimes. "That's far enough, Mr. Mitchell," Vincent called out, his voice carrying easily through the still night air. "You've led us on quite an adventure, but it ends here. You're trespassing on private property, you've broken into secured structures, and I'd be well within my rights to defend myself against an intruder, especially one who appears to be stealing documents that belong to me." Aaron's hand tightened on the strap of the document bag across his chest, the evidence that represented 4 decades of theft and murder, the proof that could bring justice to 17 families and put Vincent away for life. "These documents prove you've been stealing land from black veterans since the 70s, Aaron said, keeping his voice steady despite the cold and fear. "They show how you murdered my Uncle Henry and at least 4 other people who got close to exposing you. That safe down there is your confession, Vincent. Every crime documented in your own handwriting." Vincent's smile was visible even at this distance, a flash of white teeth in the moonlight, utterly without warmth. "Is that so? And who exactly do you think will believe you, Aaron? A troubled veteran with PTSD who broke into my property and stole private banking records? I'll admit, some of those old files contain sensitive information, mistakes made by my father and grandfather in how they conducted business back in less enlightened times. But nothing criminal, certainly nothing that rises to the level of murder. Your uncle died of heart disease, the medical examiner said so. Harold Briggs's father fell off a cliff while drunk. Tragic accidents, nothing more." He took several steps closer. The shotgun still held casually, but unmistakably ready. "You see, I control the narrative here, just as my family always has. The sheriff is my cousin. The prosecutor is my former law partner, the judge who'd hear any case you might bring graduated law school with me. You have no power here, no voice that matters, and no future unless you're smart enough to accept reality." Aaron felt the old familiar weight of systemic injustice pressing down on him, the knowledge that Vincent was probably right about how this would play out if they followed normal channels. But he'd come too far, lost too much, to surrender now. "I'm not giving you these documents," Aaron said flatly. "And you're not going to shoot an unarmed veteran in front of witnesses who can testify against you." Vincent's expression hardened, the veneer of civility cracking. "What witnesses? Your dog?" "I see no one else here, Aaron. Just you, me, and a problem that needs solving. Your uncle made the same mistake you're making now. He thought justice mattered more than power. He was wrong, and it cost him everything. Don't make me teach you the same lesson the hard way." He raised the shotgun, no longer pretending civility, and aimed it directly at Aaron's chest. "Last chance. Give me the bag, walk away, and I'll let you live. Refuse, and I bury you in these mountains where no one will ever find you. Those are your only options." Time seemed to slow as Aaron calculated impossible odds and worse choices, but Nova made the decision that changed everything. She exploded forward with a speed and ferocity that caught everyone by surprise. 70 pounds of muscle and trained aggression launched like a missile at Vincent's gun arm. The shotgun discharged as Nova hit him, the blast going wide and high, pellets shredding bark from a tree 10 feet to Aaron's left. Vincent screamed as Nova's jaws locked on his wrist, the weapon falling from nerveless fingers, and then chaos erupted as Vincent's 2 enforcers rushed forward. Aaron ran to intercept the nearest one, a heavy-set man with a knife that gleamed in the moonlight, using momentum and training to drive his shoulder into the man's midsection and take them both to the ground in a tangle of limbs. They rolled in the dead leaves, grappling for advantage, the knife slashing close enough that Aaron felt the wind of its passage near his face. He got his hand on the man's wrist, twisting hard, hearing bone crack and the knife tumbling away. A punch to the jaw stunned his opponent long enough for Aaron to scramble to his feet, turning to find the second enforcer already engaged with Nova, who'd released Vincent to protect Aaron from this new threat. The dog moved like a shadow, darting in to bite and tear before dancing back out of reach, her training evident in every economical movement. The man swung a heavy branch at her, connecting with her ribs hard enough that Aaron heard the impact and Nova's yelp of pain, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she attacked with renewed fury, going for the man's legs, bringing him down hard enough that his head bounced off a rock and he went still. Vincent had retrieved his shotgun and was bringing it up again, his face twisted with rage and pain from the mauling Nova had given him, his coat torn and bloodied. "I'm going to kill that animal," he snarled, "and then I'm going to kill you slowly." But before he could aim, Nova was on him again, this time with no hesitation or mercy. She hit him like a freight train, jaws finding his gun arm and clamping down with bone-crushing force. Vincent's second scream was higher, more desperate, and the shotgun fell again as he tried to beat Nova away with his free hand. Aaron ran forward and kicked the weapon into the brush, then pulled Nova back before she could do permanent damage. "Enough," he commanded, and Nova released immediately, blood on her muzzle, standing between Aaron and Vincent with every muscle quivering but obeying despite her clear desire to finish the fight. Vincent collapsed to his knees, cradling his mangled arm, and for the first time since this confrontation began, Aaron saw genuine fear in the older man's eyes. The invincible power broker who'd terrorized a county for 40 years suddenly looked old and breakable, brought low by a dog and a veteran who refused to be another victim. "It's over, Vincent," Aaron said, breathing hard. "The evidence is going to the FBI, not your local friends. And Nova and I are walking out of here alive." But even as he spoke, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a deep rumbling from above them on the mountain, growing rapidly louder. Vincent heard it too and began laughing, a broken, desperate sound. "Too late," he gasped. "My men set charges in the old mine shaft above this position before you even entered the cabin. Controlled avalanche, supposed to seal the cave system after we dealt with you. It's already triggered, and there's no stopping it now." The rumble became a roar as thousands of tons of snow, ice, and rock began sliding down the mountainside toward them, an avalanche that would bury everything in its path. Aaron had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine if any of them survived. He looked at Vincent, bleeding and helpless, then at the two unconscious enforcers, and every instinct screamed to leave them and save himself and Nova. But Uncle Henry's voice echoed in his memory, words from a conversation years ago about what separated good men from evil ones, about how justice demanded you do the right thing even when it cost you everything. Aaron cursed, grabbed Vincent by his good arm, and hauled him upright. "Nova, find the way out," he commanded, and the dog took off running parallel to the slope, not up or down but across, moving with certainty that suggested she'd studied this terrain during Henry's reconnaissance. Aaron dragged Vincent after her, the older man stumbling and crying out in pain but having no choice except to follow or be left behind. They ran through the trees as the avalanche's leading edge hit the position they'd just vacated, the sound like the end of the world, trees snapping like matchsticks, and the ground shaking beneath their feet. Nova led them to a shallow gully that cut across the slope, its banks high enough to provide minimal shelter, and Aaron shoved Vincent down into it just as the main body of the avalanche swept past above them, a wall of white death that blotted out the moon and filled the air with choking powder. They huddled in the gully for endless seconds, while the mountain tried to kill them, debris raining down, the temperature dropping even further from the mass of snow. When the rumbling finally stopped and Aaron dared to look up, the landscape had been transformed. Trees buried or stripped bare, the ground covered in 10 feet of compacted snow and rock, and no sign of Vincent's two men who'd been unconscious at the impact point. They were gone, buried so completely they might not be found until spring, and Aaron felt sick knowing that even men who tried to kill him didn't deserve to die that way. The immediate danger had passed, but they were now in an even more precarious situation. The avalanche had dumped them in a snowfield miles from the nearest road, in sub-zero temperatures. With Vincent injured and in shock, Aaron's clothes still wet and beginning to freeze, and Nova limping from the blow to her ribs. The document bag had stayed secure across Aaron's chest, the evidence protected even if they all died of exposure bringing it out. Aaron pulled out his emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the universal distress signal, knowing it was probably futile but having to try. He repeated the signal every few minutes as he forced himself and his companions to move, knowing that staying still meant freezing to death. Nova led again, moving more slowly now, her breath coming in labored pants that suggested broken ribs or worse, but still determined to find safety. Vincent stumbled along between consciousness and shock, his mangled arm pressed to his chest, mumbling incoherently. They struggled through the snow for what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes before Nova stopped and began barking. Sharp, urgent sounds that Aaron had learned meant she'd found something important. He caught up to her and saw what she'd discovered. A small hunting cabin, old but intact, its door unlocked, an interior offering shelter from the killing cold. Aaron got Vincent inside and immediately began the process of starting a fire in the ancient potbelly stove, using kindling from a wood box and matches from a survival tin on the mantel. His hands shook so badly he could barely strike the matches, but the third one caught, and soon flames were crackling, the most beautiful sight Aaron had ever seen. While the cabin warmed, Aaron worked on Nova, checking her injuries by the growing firelight. The blow to her ribs was serious but not immediately life-threatening, and he wrapped her midsection with strips torn from a blanket, binding the injury to prevent movement. Nova endured the treatment stoically, licking his hands when he finished, and Aaron buried his face in her fur for a moment, overcome by gratitude and love for this incredible animal who'd saved his life multiple times in a single night. He turned his attention to Vincent, who'd regained full consciousness, and was watching Aaron with an expression caught between hatred and confusion. "Why did you pull me out?" Vincent asked, his voice hoarse. "I tried to kill you. I killed your uncle. You should have left me to die in the avalanche." Aaron met his gaze steadily while bandaging the arm Nova had mauled, using the cabin's first aid supplies. "Because I'm not you, Vincent. I believe in justice, not revenge. You're going to face a court, answer for your crimes, and every family you destroyed is going to see you in chains. That's worth more than your death." He secured the bandage tightly. Perhaps more tightly than necessary. "Decides, Nova decided. When she jumped back to pull you from the avalanche path, she made the choice to save you, and I trust her judgment more than my anger." Vincent looked at the dog, who lay near the fire watching him with eyes that held no forgiveness but also no hatred, just the steady gaze of a professional doing her job. "That dog is remarkable," Vincent said quietly. "Just like the one your uncle had during the war. Henry talked about Shadow constantly when we were young, before everything went wrong between our families. I'd forgotten that until now." He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "My father taught me that power was the only thing that mattered, that people like your family were obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited. I've spent 40 years living that philosophy, and it's brought me money and control but nothing else. No family, no friends I can trust, just fear and corruption." He looked at Aaron with something that might have been regret. "I'm 73 years old, and I've wasted my entire life being a monster. The funny thing is, I don't even remember why I started. Just that it became easier than stopping." Aaron didn't respond to Vincent's confession, refusing to give the man absolution or sympathy. Regret discovered at the moment of defeat was cheap and meaningless, changing nothing about the lives destroyed or the people murdered. He checked his phone and found 1 bar of signal, enough to send a text to Emma Ross with their approximate coordinates and the message, "Alive. Have Vincent. Send rescue." The reply came 20 minutes later. "Choppers incoming. Federal marshals notified. Hold position." Aaron showed the message to Vincent, whose face went gray. "Federal marshals? I sent copies of everything in that safe to a lawyer in Charleston before I ever went to the cabin," Aaron explained, "with instructions to forward them to the FBI and the Department of Justice if I didn't check in by midnight. Your local protection doesn't extend to federal law enforcement, Vincent. They've been looking for a reason to investigate your bank's practices for years, but nobody had evidence that would stick. Now they do, and it's all documented in your own handwriting." Vincent closed his eyes, the last of his resistance draining away. "Then, it really is over." "Yes," Aaron confirmed. "It's over." They sat in silence after that, waiting for rescue, listening to the wind howl around the cabin and the fire crackle in the stove. Nova slept fitfully, her injuries paining her but her breathing steady. Aaron kept watch, unable to rest, his mind replaying the night's events and marveling that they'd survived. Dawn was breaking when they heard the helicopters, and by the time the sun fully rose, federal agents were securing the scene, medics were treating injuries, and Vincent Hartley was being read his rights and led away in handcuffs to face justice that was 40 years overdue. The helicopter ride to the hospital was a blur of medical attention and debriefing, agents asking questions while EMTs worked on Aaron's hypothermia, and Nova received emergency veterinary care. Aaron refused to be separated from his dog, insisting Nova ride in the same aircraft, and the agents didn't argue after hearing abbreviated versions of what they'd survived. At the Regional Medical Center in Charleston, Aaron was treated for exposure, dehydration, and minor injuries. But he discharged himself against medical advice after only 6 hours, demanding to know Nova's condition. The veterinary surgeon who'd operated on her met him in the waiting room with a tired smile. "She's going to be fine," the doctor said. 3 cracked ribs, some tissue damage, significant bruising, but nothing that won't heal. She's incredibly tough, and more importantly, she has the strongest will to survive I've seen in my 20 years of practice. I think she knew you needed her to make it, so she simply refused to give up. The doctor led Aaron to the recovery area where Nova lay on a padded table, groggy from anesthesia but alert enough to thump her tail weakly when she saw him. Aaron knelt beside her, careful not to jar her injuries, and pressed his forehead to hers. "You saved me," he whispered. Over and over, "You saved me." "I don't have words for what that means." Nova's tongue licked his face once, a gesture that said everything necessary, and Aaron felt tears he'd been holding back for hours finally break free. He'd lost his uncle, nearly lost his own life, and carried the weight of 2 men whose deaths in the avalanche he couldn't prevent, but he'd survived, and he'd won, and the loyal partner beside him was the reason for both outcomes. "She's a hero," the vet said quietly. "We'll put her in for commendation with the State Canine Association. What she did last night exceeds anything in the textbooks." Aaron nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and stayed beside Nova as she drifted back to sleep, her body finally able to rest now that her mission was complete and her partner was safe. 6 weeks passed in a flurry of legal proceedings, media attention, and slow healing. Federal prosecutors built an airtight case against Vincent Hartley, using the documents Aaron had recovered, cross-referenced with modern forensic analysis of Uncle Henry's and 4 other suspicious deaths. The arsenic poisoning was confirmed through exhumation and tissue sampling, and Vincent's handwritten notes proved premeditation and malice. His trial was moved to federal court in Washington, D.C. after defense attorneys argued successfully that no jury in West Virginia could be impartial. Aaron attended every day of the 3-week trial, sitting in the gallery with Nova at his feet, her presence a quiet reminder of why this mattered. 17 families testified about losing their land, their savings, and in some cases their lives to Vincent's systematic fraud. Harold Briggs, now vindicated after 42 years of knowing the truth and being powerless to prove it, gave testimony that reduced several jurors to tears. When the verdict came back guilty on all 13 counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, the courtroom erupted in applause that the judge didn't bother to silence. Vincent Hartley, 73 years old and facing consecutive sentences totaling 40 years without possibility of parole, showed no emotion as he was led away to spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His co-conspirators, including the local sheriff and the complicit judge, faced separate trials and their own ruin. Outside the courthouse, Aaron stood before a crowd of reporters and family members, Nova sitting calmly at his side wearing the law enforcement commendation medal she'd received the previous week. "This is for Uncle Henry," Aaron said simply. "For Harold's father. For every family that Vincent Hartley stole from and thought he could silence. Justice took 40 years, but it finally arrived, and it wouldn't have happened without this incredible dog who refused to let evil win." He reached down to scratch Nova behind the ears, and cameras flashed, capturing an image that would become iconic in the movement for veteran rights and criminal justice reform. A black veteran and his German shepherd standing together against a system designed to destroy them both. The settlement money from the class action lawsuit against Hartley Bank came to $3.2 million, divided among the 17 families. Aaron's share was $190,000, and he used it to purchase the old cabin property and the surrounding 50 acres, transforming the site of so much pain into something redemptive. He spent 3 months rebuilding the cabin into a modern facility, erasing all traces of Vincent's evil while preserving the historical elements, and in January, he opened the Uncle Henry Mitchell Center for Veteran Legal Advocacy. The center provided free legal services to veterans facing discrimination, housing insecurity, and systemic barriers to benefits, staffed by volunteer attorneys and law students who wanted to make a difference. Emma Ross left the Sheriff's Department to become the center's Director of Investigations, bringing her law enforcement experience and passion for justice to help veterans navigate complex bureaucratic systems. Harold Briggs, despite his age, volunteered 3 days a week as a counselor, sharing his story and offering hope to others who'd faced similar injustices. The center's logo featured a silhouette of a German shepherd, honoring Nova's crucial role in making all of it possible. Aaron lived in a small apartment attached to the center, dedicating himself fully to the work, finding purpose in helping others the way Uncle Henry had helped him. Nova, fully recovered from her injuries, became the center's therapy dog. Her calm presence soothing veterans struggling with PTSD, her story inspiring them to believe that even overwhelming odds could be overcome. Local veterans began referring to her as Saint Nova, and Aaron didn't discourage the nickname because in many ways it was accurate. She'd saved not just his life but his soul, giving him reason to believe that goodness could triumph over corruption when courage and loyalty combined. On a cool afternoon in late March, almost 5 months after the night that changed everything, Aaron sat on the rebuilt cabin's porch with Nova stretched out beside him, her head on his lap while he scratched her favorite spot behind her left ear. The forest was coming back to life after winter, birds singing in the trees, and the creek running clear and full with snowmelt. Harold sat in a rocking chair to Aaron's right, smoking a pipe and watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. Emma arrived with coffee and updates on 3 new cases the center was taking on. All veterans facing discriminatory lending practices from banks that hadn't learned the lessons of Vincent Hartley's downfall. They talked strategy and law for an hour, but eventually conversation drifted to quieter topics. Memories of Uncle Henry, stories of Shadow the War Dog, and reflections on how far they'd come. "You know what Henry used to say about fighting racism?" Harold asked, his voice thoughtful in the gathering dusk. "He said it wasn't just about standing up to the obvious hatred, the slurs and the violence. He said the real battle was against the systems designed to keep us powerless. The banks and courts and laws written to benefit some people while crushing others. He said that kind of racism was harder to fight because it hid behind respectability and claimed to be neutral, but it was more destructive than any Klan rally because it stole futures, not just dignity." Harold looked at Aaron with eyes that held both sorrow and pride. "You finished what he started, son. You exposed a system of theft that had operated for half a century, and you did it the right way, with evidence and law instead of violence. That matters more than you know, because now 17 families have their land back, and hundreds of veterans will get help from this center. You turned a site of evil into a beacon of justice. Henry would be proud beyond words." Aaron felt emotion tighten his throat, but he managed to speak around it. "I couldn't have done any of it without Nova. She's the real hero here. Every time I faced a choice between giving up and pushing forward, she showed me what loyalty and courage looked like. When I wanted to leave Vincent to die in the avalanche, she ran back to save him because it was the right thing to do, even though he'd tried to kill us both. That kind of moral clarity, that absolute commitment to doing right regardless of personal cost, that's what Uncle Henry tried to teach me my whole life, and Nova embodied it perfectly when I needed it most." He looked down at the dog, whose amber eyes gazed back with the infinite patience and trust that defined their bond. She connected 2 generations of fighters, from Shadow and Henry in the war, to us in this different kind of battle. She carried their legacy forward, and made sure it meant something. I think that's what Uncle Henry intended when he sent her to me. He was passing the torch, making sure the fight for justice continued even after he was gone. Emma added her own thoughts softly. "My father used to say that the truest measure of a person's character was how they treated those who had no power, no voice, no ability to fight back. Vincent Hartley failed that test in every possible way, using his power to destroy the powerless. But you, Aaron and Nova, and all of us working together, we passed it. We gave voice to people who'd been silenced for decades. and we proved that justice isn't just for the wealthy and connected, it's for everyone, or it's for no one. The three of them sat in companionable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged, sharing the peace of knowing they'd fought a hard battle and won, not just for themselves but for a principle larger than any individual, the radical idea that all people deserve dignity, fairness, and the protection of law, regardless of the color of their skin or the size of their bank account. As the night deepened and they prepared to head inside, Aaron spoke one final thought aloud, a realization that had been forming over the months of recovery and rebuilding. You know what I learned from all of this? That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to stand for justice even when the cost is everything you have. I was terrified every step of the way, from entering that cabin to confronting Vincent to nearly drowning in those caves. But Nova was beside me, and Uncle Henry's mission was driving me, and the families who'd been robbed deserved someone to fight for them. So I kept going, even when it seemed hopeless. And somehow we made it through. He scratched Nova's ears one more time, then stood, the dog rising with him in perfect synchronization. Uncle Henry left me more than a deed and a dog. He left me a purpose and a partner. Together, we honored his memory by finishing what he started, and we'll keep honoring it by helping every veteran who walks through these doors looking for justice. That's our mission now, and it's one worth dedicating our lives to. Harold and Emma nodded agreement, and they went inside together, 4 survivors of a battle against systemic evil, bound by shared trauma and triumph, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring because they'd already survived the worst and come out stronger. Nova followed last, pausing at the threshold to look back at the forest and mountains where she'd become a legend, then turned and padded inside to her bed by the fireplace, a hero at rest but always ready for the next call to duty. If you or someone you know has faced discrimination or injustice, share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters and can inspire others to seek justice. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of courage, loyalty, and triumph over injustice. Stories that honor veterans and the incredible bond between humans and their canine heroes. Click on the next video appearing on your screen now for another heartwarming story of a veteran and his loyal companion who changed each other's lives forever. Thank you for supporting these stories and honoring our veterans and their families. Drop a comment 17 for the 17 families who finally received justice after 40 years, and for every veteran who still fights for dignity and fairness today.